Welcome everybody. My name is Greg Goodland. I'm the Rio Grande National Forest Public Affairs Officer, and very, very pleased to welcome you tonight to our Forest Specialist Series presentation with Rachel Hosna, our botanist. And I really don't like taking a whole lot of time to say welcome, but we're going to get right started with the technical aspects of it today. So Kelly, our VIS coordinator, Kelly DeFi, is going to walk you through some of those things. And but I do want to encourage before we get Kelly into the depth of this is let's be interactive tonight. If you have a question, we'd sure like to hear from that. She'll say more on that. But you know what, we got a small group, not that small, but yeah, and let's see what Rachel thinks about that. But anyway, I'll give you to Kelly DeFire, our VIS coordinator with the San Juan Mountains Association, on behalf of both that organization and the Rio Grande National Forest. Welcome. Take it away, Kelly.
So, like you said, I'm Kelly, San Juan Mountains Association. I'm out of the Del Norte office, the Divide Ranger District. So, mostly just housekeeping stuff. The presentation's around 40 minutes. You're welcome to ask questions, but we ask you to just stay on mute unless you're asking a question, or you can raise your hand or type it into the chat, and we'll be watching the chat. And if you raise your hand, we'll try and get you called on like in school. And what was that? Sorry. Okay. So, and the other thing that we have going on is we have a door prize. So if you want to put your name in the chat, I have a booklet about trees and native to Colorado. And then I've got an SJMA cap for anyone who wants to be in the door prize. I'll announce that at the end. And with that, I think we're ready for Rachel to begin.
Okay. Now let's see if I can share my screen. Okay. Can you see it? Oh, nope. Click share.
There we go. I see it now.
And the slides are moving?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me move this out of my way. Minimize. Oh, man, this is why we practice. Okay. So, hi everybody, I'm Rachel Hasna. I've been on the Rio for a full year and in the Valley for about 2. And before coming to the forest, most of my botany work was in desert systems like the Mojave and Colorado Plateau deserts in Nevada and Utah. So getting to have trees and water and sometimes snow where I work is super cool, but not a lot of overlap in plant species that I'm familiar with. So I'm definitely still learning all of the Rio's plants and the ecosystems they grow in, which actually makes my job really fun because I get to learn something every single day. So the talk is Plants of the Rio Grande National Forest, the good, the bad, and the weird. And I have about 28 slides, and I'll try and keep it to 40 minutes with time for questions, but sometimes I geek out and go on tangents. But with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So really quickly, we're going to talk about some Botany 101 because I do want to touch on some of the important characters when identifying plants. Flowers and leaves are really big ones, but fruits and hairs are also important for some species. And no matter what level of interest you have in plants, these minute details, I think, like fruits and hairs, are also just super cool. And also sometimes friends ask me, like, what is this plant? And they show me one little piece or show me a picture. And if it's not a species that I'm super familiar with, it might be hard because sometimes you need a lot more than just a flower and a leaf. And then we'll talk about the good plants, so thinking about pollinators and wildlife, and then the quote-unquote bad, we'll talk about some noxious weeds, and then the weird, just some unique and cool plants that occur on the forest. And then finally, if there's time, I'll go over some resources for plant ID and citizen science opportunities. And here's where I just want to make a quick note that the Rio Grande has approximately 1,000 species of vascular plants. And that's a conservative guess based on herbarium records that have been collected on the forest and other internal records that I've found. And so I'm only going to talk about like 16 plants today, and some of those are non-native noxious weeds. So we are just scratching the surface of some cool plants that you can find on the Rio. Okay, so Plant ID 101 flowers. So we've all learned the parts of a flower maybe in grade school, right? You've got the petals that are usually really showy. You've got the sepals, sometimes that's called the calyx. Then you've got the female parts that have a few different components like the stigma, style, and ovary, and that's where the seeds develop. And then you've got the male parts, the stamen, which is comprised of the anther and the filament. And while this diagram is awesome, it's also way oversimplified because in reality, if you walk out the door and go in the forest, flowers look a lot more like this, which is totally wild. And this is why I love looking at flowers and plants every single day. There's a lot of sneaky plants on the forest trying to keep you on your toes. So I just want to go through each of these really quick. So first we have the elephant heads to your far left, I think. And these are one of my favorites because I love elephants. So if you look at that, like how many petals are there? Is each ear a petal? Is the trunk a petal? And I actually looked at one very closely last week. And if you look, it's kind of like one giant origami petal that's fused together, which is really cool. In the bottom center is a little Heliomyrus multiflora. It's in the sunflower family. And some of you might look at this and say, well, obviously, Rachel, those are the petals on the outside and all that other stuff that you were talking about is in the middle. But actually, plants in the sunflower family have hundreds of flowers just on that single one right there. And they often have two types of flowers. So the ones on the outside that have what you see is looks like a petal, that's called a ray flower. And on the inside are a bunch of really tiny flowers called disc flowers. And so they have small petals that are fused together. In the top right, some people forget that grasses have flowers too. And this is a really beautiful one where the male parts are yellow and the female parts are these little purple pieces. And then in the top center is Castanea, a species of Castanea. Those are Indian paintbrushes. And often that showy part, whether it's yellow here or sometimes you see red and pink ones, those are actually bracts that surround a smaller, much less showy flower on the inside. And then finally, in the bottom right, we have Asclepias or milkweed. You might be looking at this like, I think those dark purple things are the petals, but then there's these like crazy horn-looking things sticking out. Like, what the heck is that? So that's a unique part of a milkweed flower. It's called the corona that contains hoods and horns. And those are really important if you're identifying different species of milkweeds. So if you care about plant ID or not, I think all of these subtleties are super neat. So next time when you look at an elephant head, even if you've looked at them a million times, maybe look a little bit closer and try and look at that big origami petal. Okay. Next is leaves. Our leaves, they're a little bit more straightforward, but as with all things in botany, they come with their own vocabulary too. So one of the first things we look at are the veins. So they can be parallel, they can be net-like, and then the shapes of leaves can be hand-shaped. Sometimes that's called palmate, spear-shaped, heart-shaped, round, or needle-like many of our conifers. And then the arrangements can be simple, they can be compound. So in this middle picture, that is one leaf with multiple little leaflets. And then there's just a different type of compound leaf on the bottom. And then leaf edges can be smooth, they can be toothed, they can be lobed. And then finally, the arrangement can tell you a lot too. So they can be alternating, they can be opposite, or they can be whorled. Okay, so like I said, sometimes flowers and leaves aren't enough. Sometimes you need fruits and hairs. And sometimes you need other things that we're not even going to talk about, which include the actual seeds and roots. But we'll talk briefly about fruits and hairs because I think they're cool and I don't think people talk about them enough. So on the left side, the slide says trichome types. So trichomes are plant hairs, and these hairs can be they can be on just about any part of the plant. They can be on the stems, the flowers, they can be on the top of the leaf, but not the bottom. They can be simple, they can lay flat on the various plant parts. They can be woolly, which those are really cool. And there are plants on the forest with these stellate hairs that you see in the middle, and those are some of my favorite. If you get a little hand lens and you look at them, they look like little shimmering stars. It's just super neat. And then you can also run into plants that have Malpighian hairs. I never know if I'm pronouncing that right, but they're neat because they're T-shaped and sometimes they're really hard to notice. So like from the top of the plant, they kind of look just like a simple hair, and you have to do a little investigation to figure out that they're actually shaped like a T. And then there's also a lot of plants on the forest that have glandular hairs, and those glandular hairs can secrete a number of things, but some of the most common are terpenoids, which are chemicals that can be used as defense against predators. And we might experience them as plants that have like a particular smell, and they can also secrete other things that make them sticky. And then next we have fruits. So fruits develop from the ovaries of a flower, which contain the ovules that turn into the seeds. And there are many different fruit types, and this diagram just only shows a few, but I picked it because it actually covers many of the types that you might see on the forest. But one big type that isn't shown here are berries. So that includes gooseberries that fall into the genus Ribes. They're also called currants. But first, on the top left, we have the pod of a pea. That's also called a legume. So we have many plants in the pea family, the Fabaceae. So many of our milk vetches, which are also called astragalus, those have kind of a pea pod type fruit. Next, we have salique, and it says salique of a crucifer. So if you think of crucifer, those are our mustards. That's the Brassicaceae family. We have a lot of rare plants on the forest in the genus Draba, and those have saliques as their fruits, which is pretty cool. A follicle of a larkspur, which many folks know what a larkspur looks like, but also our columbines have follicle type fruits. Capsules, we don't have Jimson weed on the forest, and this is a pretty elaborate capsule with all these little spikes on it, but penstemons, which we'll talk about later, have capsule type fruits. And then caryopsis of a corn, so corn is a grass, and our grasses have caryopsis type fruits. And then samara of a maple, we do have Rocky Mountain maple on the forest, so you might see those kind of fruits. Some people hold them up to their mouth and they look like they have a little mustache, which is pretty funny. A schizocarp of a carrot. So we have many plants in the carrot family. Those are our lomatiums, or biscuit roots, or wild carrots, and our poisonous hemlocks. We do have gamble oak, so the nuts of an oak. And then finally, we have many different species that fall into the sunflower family, and they have achene fruits. Okay, so getting into the meat of the talk. But first I just want to say, when I came up with this talk title, I thought it was catchy, but binning plants into any category like good, bad, or weird is maybe a little bit misleading because those terms are human constructs. And for plants, basically all of them, except for the really bad, noxious one, provide important ecosystem services. So even those weird ones are really important too. So for the purposes of this talk, the good plants I'm going to talk about are those, a handful that have good important connections specifically for wildlife and pollinators. But first, to talk about some ecosystem services that plants provide. They provide regulating services, so they stabilize soil and prevent erosion. They help purify our air and filter water. They provide provisioning services, so that's fuel. I know our house is heated by wood that we collect on the forest, as well as providing fiber and medicine, and then food for both humans and wildlife. They have supporting services, and those are just that plants are an integral part of food webs, and therefore they help support all the biodiversity that we see on the forest, in addition to providing habitat for wildlife. And then finally, cultural. The use of plants by indigenous cultures is a big one, but then they also give us our sense of place, so they have intrinsic value. Okay, so our first plant is mountain mahogany, Cercocarpus montanus. It's in the rose family. And in Greek, Cercocarpus means tailed fruit, which you can kind of see in this picture on the left. It also looks a little feathery, which is kind of cool. It's a shrub that grows 3 to 20 feet tall. And for the most part, it occurs at our lower elevations on the forest. It's not super widespread, but you can definitely find it if you keep your eyes peeled. It's wind pollinated, which you might be able to guess by the fact that it doesn't have really showy petals to attract pollinators. It can also resprout, which is pretty neat. And one of the great things about it is that it's highly palatable as a browse species. It's high in nitrogen, and it's available all year round. So deer, bighorn, elk, pronghorn, they all love mountain mahogany. Next, we have bearberry, Arctostaphylos urvauci. It's in the Ericaceae family. I love putting plant families on here because I think they help connect us to other plants that we're familiar with. So the Ericaceae is also called the heath family. but it's the same family that blueberries are in, which you might be able to guess by looking at these fruits, although these fruits are red and blueberries are blue. Bearberry flowers May to mid-June, so we've probably missed the flowering period for this species. It's pretty common across the Rio Grande. It grows kind of as ground cover. And the fruits are eaten by a ton of different animals: birds, turkey, elk, small mammals, and black bears. And this one's actually a double whammy, so it provides food for wildlife, but it's also really important for some specialist bees. And there's a really cool report by the Rocky Mountain Research Station that I have a link to here, that is called Assessing Pollinator Friendliness of Plants and Designing Mixes to Restore Habitat for Bees. So that's where some of that research comes from. Next, we have the red osier dogwood, Cornus sericea. It's in its own family, Cornaceae. What's kind of neat about this one is it has opposite branching. It flowers late May to June, but the bright red stems you can usually see year round. And this species is mostly found in riparian areas along streams, and the stem and the fruit are both food for wildlife. And again, double whammy on this one. It's also very valuable to pollinators, specifically specialist bees. Okay. Oh, I think I have some. Okay, there we go. Okay, next is Penstemon barbatus and Penstemon whippelanus. I actually have two other penstemons on here. So penstemons are in the Plantaginaceae, the plantain family. And something that I learned researching for this talk is that penstemons are nearly endemic to North America. So you're not going to find penstemons anywhere else in the world except for a couple exceptions, which is really, really neat. And I had no idea before I was putting this talk together. So first, we're going to talk about Penstemon barbatus. It's the red one here in the top right. It has red flowers, as you can see, and it's hummingbird pollinated. You'll find it mostly on the lower elevations of the Rio Grande. It's blooming right now all over the forest. And then in the top left, we have Penstemon whippelanus. I love this one because I love the color purple. Sometimes they're almost black. And these are found mostly in montane, subalpine, alpine environments. They're fairly common across the Rio, and these are pollinated by bumblebees. So that's pretty cool. The same genus of plant, depending on the flower structure and color, can be pollinated by two wildly different species. And then I added these two pictures down here. This bigger penstemon, if I can use my cursor, is Penstemon strictus. And then this penstemon right here is Penstemon crandallii. This group of plants, the penstemons, are called beard tongues. And I thought these were two kind of good pictures to get a sense for that. So penstemons have an infertile stamen. So remember, stamens are the male part of the flower. And so these are structures that are not fertile. They do not produce pollen, but they help influence pollination. And so oftentimes they are hairy. So this one is hairy almost the whole length down, and this one is hairy just at the tip, which is pretty cool. Okay, and then I think this is our last group of plants in the good category are the milkweeds. So we've got Asclepias hallei on the left and Asclepias speciosa on the right. Milkweeds are really important because monarch caterpillars feed exclusively on milkweed leaves. So they're the larval host. And what's cool about the Rio is that we're at this interesting junction between the eastern and the western populations of the monarch butterfly. So the Rocky Mountains are the dividing line between those two populations. But there's definitely been observations of monarchs in the area. So these are the two most common species that you will see if you're out and about. Asclepias hallei is tracked by the Colorado Natural Heritage Program as a G3S3, and that means it's vulnerable. It's really only found in south central Colorado. And on the Rio, I have found plants blooming kind of the beginning of Farmers Creek outside of Creed. There's also a lot to be found along the road towards the Cathedral Campground on the Divide Ranger District, but then also you can see it just alongside the highway, both on 160 and 114 by Saguache. And milkweeds are cool because they're attractive to many other pollinators, so even wasps, which is pretty neat. Okay, next we have the bad, our noxious weeds. And so we're specifically going to talk about noxious weeds here. People like to throw out all kinds of other words like invasive, non-native, weeds, exotic, noxious. And if people are really interested, I can get into the nuances later. But when we talk about the Rio Grande Weed Program or the Rio Grande Invasives Program, we're really talking about noxious weeds. Those are our priority. And I won't read the full definition here, but noxious weeds are always non-native and invasive. We often call them weeds, but they have a very specific legal definition. And because they're regulated by law, the noxious weed list can vary from state to state. And the Colorado Department of Agriculture is the best source of information on Colorado noxious weeds. So the first noxious weed we're going to learn about is cheatgrass. It's a grass, so it's in the Poaceae bromus tectorum. It's an annual grass with hairy leaves and a drooping seed head. There are many other non-native annual bromes that you might find on the Rio, but cheatgrass is the only noxious weed. Part of why it's bad is that it germinates really quickly early in the season and taps into water and other resources before native plants can establish. And they also die back sooner in the summer than many of our natives. And that creates a potential fuel hazard, particularly if there's a really bad infestation that connects native vegetation. So in this picture on the top here, you can see a lot of cheatgrass growing in the interspace between these native shrubs. So if a lightning was to strike, that would carry fire across this landscape because it's creating this continuous fuel. Something new that I learned is that it can flower and set seed twice in a season, so spring and fall, and that the fall seed crop often has better germination. What's in our favor as land managers is that seeds can only live about 3 years in the soil. And as you'll see, compared to other species that I'm going to talk about, that's really not that long of a time. So if you have a small infestation, this is an annual species that you can pull. And if you keep on it, in a few years, you might have eradicated it. So next we're going to talk about oxeye daisy. It's an ornamental plant that escaped cultivation. And this one is tricky because it spreads quickly via their root system, so underground root system called the rhizomes. And the seeds can remain viable for up to 38 years. So this is a double hitter. We've got roots spreading underground, and we've got each flower that can produce 200 seeds and live for 38 years. So that's a really big concern. It blooms between June and August. In many places, it's blooming right now, and it grows at some of our higher elevations up to 11,000 feet. It can be effectively pulled by hand. There's actually a volunteer project this weekend up at Moon Pass where we're going to pull oxeye daisy and work on eradicating it. But it can take many years just because it is a perennial species. And so just a caution to anybody out there that before you kind of throw out any wildflower mix, just check the contents. Hopefully it's not in any of them, but it's good to just do your due diligence and make sure that you're not accidentally seeding some oxeye daisy into your yard. Next is yellow toadflax, Linaria vulgaris. This is an aggressive perennial forb, another one that spreads via its roots, but also through its seeds. It can grow 1 to 3 feet tall. It has these really pretty and showy snapdragon-like flowers, and then it has linear leaves. And often hand pulling is effective because this one is really aggressive, and if you don't get all of the root system out, it can resprout. And as you can see in this picture, this is a native pollinator on a toadflax flower. So that's something that we are very mindful about when we treat, that we either are treating before flowers emerge or after, or we're chopping the seed heads off so that we make sure that we're not impacting our native pollinators, particularly our bumblebees. Next is musk thistle, Cardus nutans. This is in a sunflower family, but this is a species that does not have those pretty ray flowers. This is a biennial species. So the first year it'll create a basal rosette, and then the following year it will shoot up and flower. And the basal rosette can crowd out and shade other native vegetation. And this is another one where the large flower heads can produce hundreds of seeds. But This is a species that I like to call as like one of our good noxious weeds, because hand pulling in small infestations can be really effective, especially if we get it that first year before it flowers and can produce seed. And this is another one that attracts many native pollinators, so we have to be pretty cautious. And then finally, we have about 20 noxious weeds on the forest, and I'm only talking about like 5 or 6, but this is the last one in today's talk, is black henbane. This one was introduced from Europe as an ornamental. It can be an annual or a biennial species, depending on where it's growing. It blooms July to September, although some places on the Rio, it can bloom earlier than July. It can grow 1 to 3 feet tall, and part of the problem with black henbane is that it's highly toxic to livestock and humans. Seed longevity is 1 to 5 years. So again, that's on the low end for seed longevity in the soil, but it's highly competitive for moisture, and it can also produce leaf and plant litter that inhibits germination of our native plants. But the upside, kind of, is that pulling is effective, and we always like to pull plants in small infestations whenever we can, so we don't have to use herbicide. So for some of these bad noxious weeds, what can you do? Just knowing what noxious weeds in your area look like is one really important thing. So again, the Colorado Department of Ag noxious weed list will tell you which species are noxious in the state of Colorado. They have pictures, they have handouts, they have a lot of really great resources. Next is to just check your clothes, your boots, your vehicles, and your pets for hitchhiking seeds. So cheatgrass, those seeds can get into the fur of an animal, they can get into your socks and your clothes. So that's a really easy one to check yourself before you leave an area. And then finally, just reporting any noxious weed sightings on the forest that you find. I'm always happy to take any reportings. My email will be at the end of this presentation. We'll talk about iNaturalist and EdMaps later. Those are 2 online resources where you can submit observations of those species as well. Okay, and then finally, maybe the category everybody's been waiting for, the super cool, wonderful, uniquely weird plants that I've cherry-picked. We're going to talk about plants that have unique adaptations or life cycles, or maybe they're just a little bit less common. And these 4, I was just trying to take up space on this slide, so we're not going to talk about these, but I'll tell you what they are really quick. And depending on the screen that you're looking at, it might be a little bit easier or harder to see some of these characteristics. So going from left to right, we have Oxytropis lambertii. So Oxytropis, sometimes the common name is birdspeak, and I tried to get a good picture of the keel of this species, of this Oxytropis, looks like a little bird's beak. And so hopefully you guys are able to see that. Mountain death camas is second here. That's Anticlea elegans. This third species is Pyrola acerifolia, or also bog wintergreen. It's another plant in the blueberry family, the Ericaceae. And then finally, of course, we have our elephant heads. Can't get enough of those. Okay, so kicking off this category, we have the funky thistle. And I just have to give a shout out to our lead range specialist in Caneos Peak, Kelly Garcia, for telling me about this plant when I first started here. I still haven't seen it in real life, but hopefully I will later this summer. It's in the sunflower family. And again, this is a species that doesn't have those showy ray flowers. It was just described in 2022, which is very, very recent to be describing a whole new species. It was previously thought to be Cirsium scopulorum, which is the mountain thistle, but after kind of looking through older barium records and doing field work and some genetics, they realized that this is actually a distinct species. It blooms late July, early August, high in alpine environments. It can grow up to 3 feet tall, which makes it really, really big compared to what we think of as being alpine vegetation as being pretty small. It supports a ton of different pollinators, and you can find it on the Rio Grande. Again, it's going to be high up in the Alpine and the Sangre de Cristos. There's a lot of observations of this species, but as well as the South San Juan Mountains, particularly on the Caneos Peak district of the Rio Grande. Next, we can't have a talk about unique plants without having at least one orchid. And this is one I got to see last year, which was pretty special. It's called rattlesnake plantain, Goodyeara oblongifolia. There's only 4 species of Goodyeara in North America, and we have one of them here on the Rio. It's pretty uncommon. It's not a rare plant, but it's uncommon on the Rio, but the species itself is pretty widespread across North America. And it grows in spruce fir forests, so that's much of the Rio is potential where you could find it. And the seeds are the size of dust. So orchids have seeds the size of dust that are dispersed by the wind, which is cool. And bumblebees are thought to be important pollinators for this one. And this species is also kind of cool because it spreads via rhizomes, which is kind of neat. Next, we have moonworts, so a species in the genus Botricium. And I will be the first to admit that I did not know what a moonwort was before I started this job. Maybe I learned about that plant family in undergrad, but it never crossed my mind again. So Botriciums are in the Ophioglossariaceae. It's an ancient lineage. They're related to ferns. They're relatively rare. So we have 2 species that occur on the Rio Grande that are on our species of conservation concern list, but we have other species that are, less common. They're very cryptic because it spends most of its life underground, and for only a really short window, the reproductive parts emerge from the soil. And on the Rio Grande, this is usually, like a week or 2 mid-August. So in each of these pictures, the fronds that will emerge, the one with the little balls on them, that's the fertile or reproductive frond that's going to release spores. And the other one looks more like a traditional frond type leaf. This is the non-reproductive one. And so what's cool is that the spores will be released into the environment where hopefully they make contact with soil via rain or that frost heaving motion that happens or erosion. And those spores can remain in the soil for 5 to 10 years until the right conditions are met. And that usually means good soil moisture and fungal connections. So Botriciums rely heavily on mycorrhizal fungi. Those are fungi associated with plant roots. And so the fungi provide Botricium with key nutrients, and the Botricium provide the fungi with food or carbohydrates. And once that spore has enough moisture and it has its fungal connections, it can still take years for it to finish its life cycle and appear above ground, as you can see in these pictures. And it's hard to tell the scale in the pictures that I'm showing here, but they're like, a couple inches tall. They're very, very itty bitty. And there's also some evidence that they can spread vegetatively via rhizomes. So if you think about the life cycle that I talked about with spores, like there is a lot going on underground, which is kind of cool to think about, like walking around the forest and being like, are there Botriciums like underneath my feet that just haven't emerged from the soil yet? It's like pretty wild. And I just want to point out a couple neat resources. So there's an In Defense of Plants, oh, I forgot a T here, an In Defense of Plants podcast episode in which they interview a former Rocky Mountain region botanist about his work with Botriciums. He's helped discover a couple different new Botricium species in Colorado. And then the U.S. Forest Service has a couple moonwort articles that talk more about how special they are. Okay. Keeping with the theme of fungi, we're going to talk about pine drops, or Pterosperma andromeda. We've talked a lot about different plants in the heath family, the Ericaceae, that blueberry family, which is a total accident, but it's kind of cool to see the variety of plants that all occur in the same family. This is a plant that has glandular hairs, and it can grow 1 to 3 feet tall. It blooms July to late August. It's a saprophytic plant that depends on really important relationships between mycorrhizal fungi and coniferous plants. So, as I mentioned before, ectomycorrhizal fungi have a lot of different benefits. They can increase the surface area of roots for a tree, enabling it to secure more nutrients. And again, the fungi get carbohydrates from the tree. And so what a saprophyte is something that feeds on decaying material. And pine drops is actually really, really interesting. So this article talks more about kind of how this plant works, but the seed germination is triggered by a chemical that's released from the mycorrhizal fungi. And then once it starts to grow, it taps into that relationship between the fungi and the pine tree, and says, instead of like giving something in exchange, like the fungi are giving nutrients and the tree is giving carbohydrates, it just says, hey, I'm going to wiggle my way in here and I'm going to take nutrients from the fungi and carbohydrates from the plant. So as you can see, this plant is red. It's not green. It's not producing any of its own nutrients. It's getting it all from that connection between the fungi and the pine trees. So that's just pretty wild. And then I think this is our final plant. So this is not a rare plant, but it's fairly rare on our forest as far as I can tell. And what I personally find uniquely wonderful about it is that the flowers like maybe kind of look like a little bit like a larkspur, and then these fruits kind of look like a short squat bean pod, and then those leaves look like kind of familiar, like a columbine, but not quite. And depending on what key you're looking at, this plant could be in its current family, the Papaveraceae, which is the poppy family, which if you know what a traditional poppy looks like, you might be saying, what? But in older keys, it's in a family called the Fumariaceae, which is such a cool name. So it's definitely been reclassified. It grows 3 to 6 feet tall, so that's pretty huge. And we know for sure that it occurs in and around Wolf Creek Pass. So I didn't say the name, it's Corydalis cassiana or fitweed or fumewort. But there is a close cousin. You can get the picture up here. Corydalis aurea, and its common name is scrambled eggs, which I think is hilarious. It can also be found on the Rio Grande at lower elevations. I see this species much more often. It's even growing outside, or it grew outside the Divide Ranger District office earlier this spring. And there's evidence to suggest that it can colonize after fire, and that fire might be important for seed germination. Although, you know, we didn't have a fire outside the Divide Ranger District, so the seeds can germinate just fine without fire. But I just think that this plant is so cool because it just confused me the first time I ever found one. I was like, what family is this in? Like, what is going on with this plant? And it's also beautiful. Okay, so getting close to the end here, just some resources for plant ID if you're interested. The USDA plants database is a big one that will show you what plants are native to various counties in Colorado. The Flora of Colorado by Jennifer Ackerfield is a really great key. We also have the Colorado Flora. They have Eastern and Western Slope editions. They just created a Colorado wildflower mobile device app, which I find pretty helpful. You can kind of tap what color the flowers are, how many petals they have, or if it's a tree, and it helps narrow it down for you. It's pretty great. And then, as I mentioned before, the Colorado Department of Ag Noxious Weeds website. And then iNaturalist, which we'll talk about in a second. Southwest Colorado Wildflowers is a website that has a lot of really great pictures and other information about many wildflowers that occur on the Rio. And I also really like going to the U.S. Forest Service Fire Effects Information System. They don't have every species in there, but it's a pretty good synthesis of a lot of the research and information about various species that occur on the Rio and elsewhere in the Forest Service across the U.S. Okay, so finally, just really quickly, how you can help us if you love plants. Even if you only learn like a couple plants a year, I just think that there's so much to be gained by getting out and getting to know the plants around you. They're such a huge part of what makes the Rio the Rio. And I always think that once you start to take a closer look, like at things like those stellate hairs, a walk in the woods becomes like a wild ride. So if you are so inclined, consider participating in some of these citizen science efforts, such as iNaturalist. So iNaturalist is both a website that also has a mobile app for your device, where you can post photos of any living thing. So birds, plants, bees, lichen. And if you don't even know what it is, that's okay. Because there's this neat artificial intelligence component that helps you identify it, and then folks like me or other botanists and enthusiasts can verify it, and it just greatly contributes to our scientific understanding of many of these organisms. I use it both on the job and in my personal non-working life I could go on about it, but I won't. It's pretty cool. Western monarch milkweed mapper. So we talked about the 2 most common milkweeds you might find on the forest. You can send pictures and locations of both milkweeds, and I think adult monarchs and their caterpillars too, to that group. And so that helps tremendously with understanding like what are monarchs doing at this weird junction between the east and west populations. And then finally, EdMaps is another website that has a mobile device that allows you to submit sightings specifically of noxious weeds. And it also contains photos and descriptions of noxious weeds that you can look at even when you don't have service. And so with that, yep, this is everything we just talked about. With that, I think this is my last slide. Hopefully we still have time for some questions. And I will stop sharing as soon as I can find it. Okay.
Rachel, amazing. Your knowledge and flow was just, I didn't want to let go, so I didn't. And I like to come on and say thank you while folks are kind of considering that. I actually wrote down a couple of things, but I certainly want to allow other folks to ask questions as they may. But I do want to address, you brought up musk thistle. While that's the worst part of this presentation is talk about the invasives, right? But I have a hunting camp on the San Isabel National Forest that recognizing musk thistle. I started many years ago pulling it, and I've basically eradicated the species from my hunting camp.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it does work. It takes commitment, and if I were to miss a year or 2, heaven forbid, then I bet I'd be right back there. But they're not there. They are around, and I think that's why they'll get there. So I think working together, we can find these areas, identify them, and say, all right, we're drawing the line. You don't get to go any further.
Yeah, exactly. And the Rio is 1.8 million acres. That's a lot of ground for a handful of us to cover. So we really appreciate folks that just happen to be out and about that see stuff and let us know. Like that is so helpful.
Yeah, big time. Then the other thing I was going to say is when you brought up that funky thistle, talking about those, I actually had what I thought was one of those in that hunting camp as well, knowing that it was a native though. It's still there, but I think it turns out to be that it's that mountain thistle.
Oh, okay.
Because it's a lot lower elevation than what you were describing. So
yeah,
they're very pretty though. I like them.
Yeah, they're really cool.
Cool. Well, hopefully a little bit of a smaller talk there allows folks that may be developing questions in their mind to come on board. Again, we love the interactions with you people out there. So talk away, see what's going on in your minds.
I have a least favorite plant on the Rio. I guess I would maybe just say toadflax, which is a non-native. So it's easy to not like a noxious weed, and it's just really, really aggressive. So I think right now that's my least favorite plant on the Rio. That's a good question.
And the worst thing about toadflax is boy, it's pretty. So it's possible that folks really like it and encourage its growth. So on the Gunnison Forest, when I worked over there, I used to hike up into the West Elk Wilderness. There was a place from yellow toad, a small colony of yellow toadflax, and I'd hike up in there with a certain chemical that we are allowed to use. I can't remember the name of it, but it's just a small little pellet, and I treated that thing every year for 5 years, and that was another one that close to eradication. So with some dedication, working together, we can get it done.
Yeah.
Probably Tordon, Greg, but we won't talk about that.
Yeah, let's not.
Rachel, did you have some invasive species that you told us about earlier? Some about things that you're looking to get rid of? There were two when you talked about it, not today, it was in another, you were talking about it earlier, like at our training. And there were two, like, was it hawkweed and something else?
Oh, a couple of species that are on the watch list, that have known to be in and around the forest. So orange hawkweed is one of them. Now I'm racking my brain for what the other one I told you was. Uh-oh, I can't think of what it is. If it comes to my brain, I'll let you know.
So when you say the watch list, what does that mean?
So those are species that haven't really taken hold in Colorado. So those are ones that are just starting to pop up, and we want to jump on them and eradicate them. Those are the ones that's like early detection, rapid response. We really want to keep our eyes out for those and keep them from becoming more established, like things like musk thistle. So we have a really good chance of keeping those out if we can get on them quick and early.
Well, you knocked my socks off, Rachel. I think maybe you did the other folks too. You know, for me, I admit I'm probably like many folks. I don't know that much about the plants, and but I do appreciate them amazingly, and I think I'd be lost without the opportunity to be around them, especially out in the forest. So I carry one of my plant guidebooks, and I look it up when I see something I think is really cool, and I learn the name of it. And probably by the time I'm done with my hike, I've forgotten it, but at least I appreciated it for a few minutes.
Yeah, for sure. They bring me a lot of joy. And if there's like one thing that people are interested in maybe investing in, a hand lens, man, once you look at a plant under a hand lens, it changes everything. There's all sorts of weird stuff going on. Those fine details, I think, are really cool.
Good advice. I think I'm going to look into that. It's probably be worth it. So that's cool. Well, anybody else with any questions? We'll wrap this up here shortly. So I certainly would like to give you the opportunity to questions or comments. I think it's wonderful. Tristram, you posted there about the orange hawkweed on Swale Lake. Oh man.
Oh, interesting. Tristram, that might be one of the locations that I was planning on checking up on this summer. That'd be good to.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah. Oh, and thank you for including moonworts, the little Botriciums. They're pretty cool.
They're super cool and so cute and just so little.
Okay, so that Tristram reminded me. That's the other thing. It's right here. Here's my pad. I wrote it on here. I haven't found myself, Rachel, walking around the forest wondering if I'm walking over Botriciums. So
But now
I'm
you will.
going to start though. All righty. Well, hey everybody. With the lack of questions, we're pulling up close to the top of the hour. I think I'll turn it over to Kelly DeFi, our VIS coordinator with San Juan Mountains Association, to let us know who the recipients of our today's door prizes are. And I'll give one last opportunity for questions, and then we'll say thanks to everybody and let you cut loose. Kelly, are you there?
Sophia, did you have a question?
I actually didn't. I was just going to comment that I really appreciate you including the information about how long the seeds are viable for the noxious weeds. I didn't actually know any of that information, so I find that that's like super, and if pulling was effective or ineffective, that's super helpful for when you're doing treatments or just knowing that in general for your own property. So thank you for including that. That's really, really nice.
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad. That was cool.
And so actually it is Sophia that won the door prize. So Congratulations.
No way. Thank you. I'm really excited. Thanks.
So, I guess we can work out the details or of how
Yeah.
to. So, if you want to send an email, if you don't mind just giving me your email address in a chat, just to me, then I can
Okay.
email you and we'll work that out.
Okay.
Kelly, Sophia, just touch base with me tomorrow, and I'll let you know how to pick that up.
Okay. Sounds good.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And just for everybody's
Appreciate it.
information, we have a random drawing that we do online. We just put everybody's name in there and let the online random drawer pick it. So again, on behalf of the Rio Grande National Forest San Juan Mountains Association, Rachel, thank you for presenting on the good, bad, and the weird wildflowers and botany on the Rio Grande National Forest, and welcome everybody for coming. We appreciate it, and you will be able to find this recording on the Rio Grande National website in the future. Thanks, everybody, and have a great night.